Every image tells a story. And our goal is to focus on the idea of narrative photography and how do we create story through a series of photographs. So the question for us isn't if a photograph tells a story, it's what story is the photograph telling? All great stories need a beginning and an end. Something wonderful happening inside. But when we're talking about narrative photography, we need to understand that we're not literally trying to tell the story. We don't want photographs that just tell us something that is easy, superficial, and doesn't require any thought or interaction. That means that the idea, the concepts for a narrative series of photographs need to be maybe more emotional or more universal, or things that go back to a memory or a moment, a shared experience, like maybe a day at the beach, finding a lone boat. Before we start exploring narrative photography, what's the process, what are the goals, the theory behind it, there are some things that we need to understand just about photography in general in order for us to be more successful, or more pleased with our images, and then be able to understand why some parts of the photograph are pleasing and other parts might not be. So these are sometimes called the creative elements, also known as compositional elements or the key elements. So let's review what those 7 elements are. So the 7 compositional elements or creative elements that we'll review are line, shape, form, texture, color, size, and depth. Understanding how these things work together or independently is very important for us and our photography. However you choose to take your photographs, whether that is going to be using a phone, a digital camera, or in my case, an old film camera. The 7 elements that we need to understand and use do not change according to the media that you use to take those photographs. So what we're looking at are elements that are universal. And they're universal not just for photography, but they're universal in any of the print media or painting, drawing, conceptual design. We're trying to create 3 dimensions on a 2-dimensional flat plane. And line, shape, form, color, texture, size, and depth are all the elements that can help us create the 3 dimensions that we would like to communicate. Classic example of a line. The road vanishing off into the distance. It's effective if the subject or the thing that you want the viewer to look at is at the vanishing point on the horizon. Some lines are organic, natural in their grace and beauty. By waves and reflection off the sky create this really wonderful mirror-like surface. Sometimes a bit blue when the sky is clear. The lines that we see left on the sand we can also use inside our compositions. This is a really good example of what is shape versus form. Shape is only 2 dimensions. So when I have lines that connect, I then have shape. Form requires the 3rd dimension. I need to have some sense of depth, not just a height or width. So here, a repeated pattern. Nice work. I've got line, I have shape, and then inside I also have shape. Now, in most situations with a background, I'm going to have line, shape, and form all over my image. That's not usually much of a problem for distraction because it would just be a natural scene that is the scenery of a background. It is not part of the front, the foreground, or the subject matter. But something like this the pattern might cause some distraction is something I would maybe want to consider inside my photograph. Is this going to be a distraction from my intended subject? Here's a good example how we can see line, shape, and form all come together to create my nice scene for my background. In many photos that we'll take, we'll have line, the form, the shape, all of those combined on many different elements in order to create that scene that we're looking for. Good use of color, contrast. You always want to look for sun and shade to create that tension sometimes, or just that flow, that sort of natural feeling. Good use of natural elements, water, the reflection, green of nature, can add a lot of relaxation or calmness to an image. Good example of when so many of the elements that I'm looking for my photographs all come together. I have my line, I have my shape, and I have my form. And one of the key elements that I'm going to always want to try and look for to create form, also to create depth, is shadow. I want to make sure that the light is in a place that creates some dramatic effect that then allows my shapes to take form and the elements in my photograph to create the personality I want. I have a smooth texture here, and I have the rough texture here. I have the wooden beams coming across. I have a bit of color in the blue sky, maybe a bit of cloud you might see. I have the ground, and it's sort of yellowish tans against the sort of gray flats. Touch of blue inside this wall. All together can create quite a dramatic photograph. Texture is when we're able to communicate a tactile feel inside the image that we have. So things that look really shiny will appear smooth. Things that obviously we know are rough will have a visual texture. And this is really important to create not just a feeling or a thought in a photograph, but an actual sense of being there. Can't catch the camel again. So the idea, texture, that familiarity with something, it's trying to express as many of the 5 senses as we can inside our image. One thing we can't do is the smell. One effective way of trying to communicate texture in our photographs is how close we are to the subject. Closer we are, obviously, the more of the element we can see, and it enhances the texture of the overall image. Understanding the dynamics of light, we're able to use the sky, the reflective surface, and the near surface to create a gradient of color and texture. All right, so I must admit, I've been finding it quite difficult to find color. And here I am at the beach, and here I was lucky enough to come across a great example of color. Color works when we have contrast. So we can see that this, right, the whiter sand with that sort of the hints of the browns. We have our green, a bit of shadow to create different contrast of green, and then of course the flower itself as the main subject. Now, a viewer will always find the brightest object first. It's sort of how it goes. So when we look at color, we want to pay attention to how the colors are arranged inside the frame, and is the brightest thing the thing I want the viewer to look at. I thought I couldn't find any color, and I'm almost home, and I ran into this guy. Great example of what? Color, vibrance, right? Or saturations. We got a bit of the texture in it. This could really make whatever subject in front is gonna pop, but yeah, there you go. But again, just remember that the brightest color, the brightest thing in your image is going to draw the viewer's attention first. So even though all of this is wonderful and it can be exciting and it's full of vibrance and energy and that feeling, you still want to make sure that it's not becoming the subject if it's not supposed to be the subject. It's a real shame that the lifeguard tower isn't here anymore. It's a great example of how you can apply contrasting colors in order to draw attention to one part of the frame, or at least one subject or object that you want inside that frame to be the point of interest. Obviously, you can't show that example anymore. Still, beautiful sight. Sometimes we can just change the perspective, the point of view in which we take our photographs in order to add a sense of either size or depth, or at least to change the visual area to give the viewer something else to think about. The size of an object is all relative to its position inside your frame. The closer an object is to the front of your frame, obviously the larger it will appear, even if the object is not that large itself. The farther away something is, obviously makes it smaller. We can understand size in relation to depth as long as we are aware of the relationship, water, between the depth of the image and the size of the object. So we need to have some reference that allows us to understand both the depth, the distance in the frame, and the object in relation to another object. So with me here, knowing my size, we can guess the size of the stone. Size is all relative when it comes to all of the objects in your frame. A known object allows us, the viewer, to then understand the relationship and proportions of everything in the frame. This is very important when we want to have some sense of balance between all of the objects. The objects that are farther away will look smaller, but still we can know the size in relation to an object that is closer to frame that is known. I'm not going to go closer to the cows, they already don't like me. But you get the idea of how we understand relative size based on known objects inside our frame. Another way that we can demonstrate depth inside of our photographs is by understanding layers, or the grounds, my foreground, my middle ground, and my background. The more effectively we can balance layers, or our grounds, the more expanse or depth we're able to show inside our images. And here, I have just a bit of a foreground right in front of the camera that then moves to the background of the midground of that rock, and then of course the road as my line pushes me back all the way into the background. Now, backgrounds are incredibly important for us because a background doesn't have to be the most important thing, but it sets the mood or the stage of the whole scene in which my photograph is being taken. So understanding where objects are within the depth that I have to my background and the foreground to the camera creates that sense of depth, which is vital for many types of photographs, especially landscapes. Depth is a concept that is highly effective and necessary when doing landscapes because of the absolute depth of actually what you are looking at. But it's also a very necessary skill to use or pay attention to even inside a smaller area of frame. By creating foregrounds, middle grounds, and backgrounds, I'm able to create a more comfortable image, something that the viewer intuitively understands inside its whole scene. And that intuitive sense allows the viewer to really look at the elements that are inside and how those elements might affect them on an emotional level or trigger memories, something that could be personal. And that would create a more effective narrative photograph. Let's just take a moment to review and wrap up the things that we've covered so far. Our 7 elements: line, shape, form, color, texture, size, and depth. These are all going to be important when we think about the compositions that we will be putting together for our narrative photographs. Now, in most images, you will see almost all of these elements. But sometimes we might want to create a composition that focuses on 1 or 3 of the elements as its primary way of communicating the image. Now, line is the most common. It is everywhere and all around us. In most cases, we don't need to think about line too much unless we are eliminating other elements so that line becomes a primary focus. Now, my horizontal lines, my vertical lines, whether I have an angled line, can all communicate a different feeling. Shape is when lines come together and create a known shape. Now, those can be either organic, made by nature, or constructed, made by man. But again, these are 2-dimensional, whereas form is when I have that 3rd dimension. That 3rd dimension comes either from a sense of depth or by shadow. Now, shape is also going to be constructed and communicated through the objects that you see in your frame. I have these 2 walls on the outside of the frame that then are moving back towards the scene behind me. So the way that I have positioned the camera allows me to create shape, and with light, shadow, and shape, I have also created depth. Let's take a moment and talk about color and texture. Color has an emotional feeling to it. Different colors create different moods or feelings inside an image. So if I have color in my frame, I do want to make sure that I understand how it can help my composition and my narrative, or maybe the color gives a feeling that I'm not trying to give. Also in scenes, texture can be quite important. Things that appear to be shiny or farther away will appear to be smooth, whereas the closer I am to something, the more tactile feeling I can communicate, which is something that we should think about, how the texture of an image is also communicating some feeling or emotion. Size and depth. Now remember, size is relative to the position of the subject to the camera. The closer the subject is, the size obviously will be larger, and the things further back would appear smaller. To understand size, we must remember that it is a relationship to the things that are inside the frame. So I represent a foreground, but a known size, more or less. And so the objects that surround me then have a point of reference to understand how big they really are. So size is all about the references inside the frame, whether that be the ground leading to the subject or the background behind it. This is also a way that we can communicate depth. If my layers are clear between each part of the photograph, the better the expression of my depth. And so depth really is the expression of how many layers or grounds that you were able to achieve effectively in your photograph. The placement of your subject within a ground is what is key in determining the effectiveness of the subject inside its space. So with these 7 elements, we're able to construct a composition, and that's going to help us place a subject inside that then will have meaning. Now, we already know that every picture tells a story. The question that we get is, what story are we trying to tell? How can I use my subject and the scenes and the elements to enhance the communication of the story that I would like the viewer to engage with? Some ways that we can do that are using objects that are symbols that represent something, locations that might have some meaning, colors that might create a reaction. But when I think about the whole idea of my narrative, I need to think about the complete composition in its totality. Narrative photography requires from us, the artist, to imprint a part of ourselves into the photographs that we are taking. And in turn,
there's also a requirement that the viewer allows themselves to open up in order to communicate and engage with the image on a free and open level, to experience things that maybe we haven't experienced or haven't wanted to experience for a long time. If we as an artist are able to push ourselves and to put part of us into the image, we will create something that a viewer wants to communicate with and open themselves up to. And that makes beautiful photography and beautiful art in general. So what that means for us is that we should try to be bold, experiment, take risks, try to push past a comfort into some place that is uncomfortable, to unlock your creative skills, to drive you forward, and to try to create something new and unique and meaningful.